dear colleagues, gentlemen, ladies, dear Mr. Tureček, I want to start my short welcome speech with and I will finish with 3 remarks. First remark is very personal. It's for me really a great pleasure that I was invited by Břetislav Tureček to take part in this conference with welcome speech, because I knew Mr. Tureček from the time as he worked for Czech radio, and it's for me really an honor that I can now be personally with him as my colleague. As far as I know, the local approach, it was always typical for him as a journalist. The local approach, with knowing languages, to talk with people. I know his books, and from this point of view, it was for me nothing surprising that the topic of our conference is Middle Eastern conflicts in a local perspective. I think the local perspective it's not easy to understand the local perspective, because to understand the local dimension, it's not enough to read in English, for example, I suppose. If you want to understand the local dimension of conflicts, you need to understand not only the people in English, but to understand the language, to understand the religion, and from this point of view, I think it's very important that the topic of religion is part of our conference, because as far as I am more specialized in the field of European Union, European integration, but as far as I assume the religion is here, for example, you don't know if I'm religious and so on. But in some countries, and I think these are the countries in the Middle East, the religion is not only private thing, but the religion, as far as I understand this, it's, as the Germans say, it's Ordnungsprinzip. It's a principle of organizing society, not only the private life. And I think this is, as far as I understand, to understand the importance of religious and the religious people and the authority of these people. It's something what is for us here in Europe to understand the importance of religion. And from this point of view, I appreciated very much that the keynote speech is linked with the religion. Second remark is linked with the spillover of the local conflicts and the spillover for Europe. It seems to me that the spillover of these local conflicts are for Europe very important, and I don't want to say that they are destructive. Some people are thinking they can be destructive, the spillover of these conflicts, because many millions of people from this region are moving not to Singapore, not to Qatar, not to Emirates, but they are moving to Europe. And as far as I know a little bit the situation in Germany and France, it's not easy for these countries to integrate these people. Sometimes these people don't want to be integrated. They want to create a parallel society. And I think this is the real challenge for Europe, for the European Union. Some people are saying that Europe is rich. No. Europe is not rich. Yes, we have 550 million people. But from these 500 million people, maybe 100 people are rich. But the rest, starting Czechs are something, if you are looking on the per capita income, from the point of view of per capita, we can see that maybe 6 or 7 countries in European Union, we can say they are rich countries. And the refugees, they know very well where are the rich countries of Europe. And this is the direction of their interest, to live in these rich countries, as far as I can assess this. From this point of view, not necessary is for the many of these people coming from this conflict region important the question of security, of the security before war and security before political regime, but it is the perspective of life for them, for their children. And I think that Europe, because the majority of Europeans are not rich, and you can talk with citizens starting with, not in Luxembourg, or not in Denmark, even in Germany, but not in Sweden, not in Norway. But if you are talking with people in other European countries, if they feel that they are rich enough to save the world from poverty, I think the answer would be no. If you are reading the last documents, for example, from the Commission from this week, you can the first sentence from one of these communication is: migration has been and will continue to be one of the defining issues for Europe for the coming decades. For the coming decades. It's of course a good information for the rest of the world, but it's not a good information, in my view, my personal view, it's not a good information for Europe, because Europe is not rich enough to save the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jakš, for your opening speech. It's really interesting to hear how you connected the Middle Eastern issues with our local ones. Maybe not everybody agreed with every single word of yours. However, we have to think about a lot of things which you said. Now, let me to welcome here our, I would say, special guest, Professor Fawaz Gerges of London School of Economics. Professor Gerges is dealing with Muslim Middle Eastern radical groups for decades. He wrote a few books about few radical groups like Al-Qaeda, and his last book, which was published just recently, a few weeks ago, ISIS, A History, is already sold in many countries, including the Czech Republic, by the way. The Neo-Luxor bookshop at Václavské náměstí has also a few copies. I'm really happy that Fawaz made it to Prague, because I understand fully that you are very busy with promoting your books and preparing another one, which has to be published until before the end of this year. So it is really my pleasure to give you a floor for your presentation about the connection which already Professor Jakš mentioned. That means a connection between Middle Eastern conflicts and religious aspects, religious level of that, because many people, and I would say a general public of the Czech Republic, takes it for granted that all of the conflicts of Middle East have to do, almost 100% have to do with the religion. That means with Muslim religion, with Islam. Maybe you have something else to say about it, so please, the floor is yours. As you like.
Thanks. Good morning. Thank you so much for the introduction. introduction and the invitation. I'm really delighted and honored to be here. So it's, and I hope you want me to hold the microphone. It's very awkward. Apologies. I was asked to talk about sectarianism, the relationship between sectarianism and politics in the Middle East. And I hope today, in my short presentation, I don't have much time, is to really puncture a hole, and a big one, in the thesis or the claim that what we're seeing in the Middle East is a kind of religious war. This is one of the most misperceived aspects about Middle Eastern politics, with all due respect, is that somehow Islam lies at the very heart of what's happening in this part of the world. This is because if we focus on the surface of things, if we focus on the rhetoric of the political movements and the radical religious movement, we think somehow that the main driver is religion. It's nonsense. And that I won't say that religion does not matter. I don't say that the sacred imagination is not important, but all I say, if we focus on religion, we're missing the big picture in the Middle East, people. If we focus on what Al-Qaeda says, if we focus on what Daesh or the Islamic State says, we're missing the big picture about the turmoil that's ravaging the heart of the Arabic and the Islamic world. This is, and I want to lay out my argument in a very simplistic terms. I don't have the time. The first point, yes, sectarianism is real. The sectarian divide in the Arab and the Islamic world is real, is creeping, it's threatening the very social fabric of the region, it's threatening the state system in the region. It's playing on Arab and Islamic streets in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Pakistan, as far as Pakistan. It is really poisoning the very veins of Arab and Islamic politics. It's real. We have to make sense of it. To say that sectarianism is important, as you well know, it's not to say that sectarianism is a key that helps us to unlock the puzzle of the region. There's a big difference between locating a problem and then locating the explanations of the problem. Point two, why? Why do we explain this creeping sectarianism? I think not only sectarianism is creeping now on the popular level, I would argue that one of the most important elements in this story is that the Saudi-Iranian fierce Cold War is pouring gasoline on a raging fire. You cannot understand why sectarianism is spreading. You cannot understand why sectarianism is basically now poisoning the veins of Arab and Islamic politics without understanding the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, a rivalry that has taken on sectarian connotation. This particular rivalry, I don't need to tell you. The Saudi-Iranian Cold War, people, is not about religion. The Saudi-Iranian rivalry is not about the sacred. The Saudi-Iranian rivalry, I'm a professor of international relations. It's about power, it's about interest, it's about rivalry, it's about who dominates the Gulf region, one of the most strategic and economic regions in the world. It's about who dominates the Arab East. It's about who is the leader of the Islamic world, symbolically. It matters here. Saudi Arabia being the birthplace of Islam, the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, where the sacred places, Saudi Arabia believes that's it. It's Islam, the end of the story. Why do you need other Islam, whether Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood? Iran is also positioning itself, wrapping itself as in a universal terms. Iran does not really want to be seen as a Shia state. Iran wants to be seen as the leader of the Islamic world. And as you know, the first phase of the Islamic revolution, it was about exporting the Islamic revolution of Iran to the entire Islamic world. Having said so, and I come back to my thesis here, even though sectarianism matters, we should not exaggerate either the power of sectarianism, the so-called Sunni-Shia divide, as an explanation or as part of really the drivers that help us to understand what's happening in the Middle East. The first point I want to make, what matters to people in the Middle East is not the Sunni-Shia divide. What matters to people in the Middle East and the overwhelming majority, bread and butter, dignity, decency, raising their children. That's the fact. All the polls we have seen, all the surveys, they tell us most people are concerned about what? They're not concerned about the Shiites penetrating the heart of the Islamic world, or somehow Sunni Muslims basically are marginalizing Shiite Islam. All the surveys that we have seen, bread and butter, dignity, decency, having a stake in the future, hope, because there is no hope in this part of the world. Let me take you quickly, I don't have the time, to the so-called Arab Spring uprising between 2010 and 2012. Let's revisit this moment, 2010, 2012. What were the most important rallying cries of the Arab Spring uprisings? Millions of Arabs, of Muslims, called for what? Al-Hurriya, Al-Karama, dignity, justice, freedom. Millions. Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and had millions. Can anyone here tell me, did you see many black flags? Did you see many calls for Islamic states? Did you see any calls to bring religion into the various countries? What were the rallying cries? If we were to summarize, I've written 2 books on that. The New Middle East, Protest and Revolution in the Arab World by Cambridge University Press, published 2012, and Contentious Politics in the Middle East, published 2015 by Oxford University Press. If we summarize the rallying cries of the Arab Spring uprising, simply universal values. I'm not saying they wanted democracy a la France or the UK or America. Rubbish. The millions of people who were out, they wanted universal values. They wanted citizenship. They wanted to take the state back from presidents for life. They were not calling for what Osama bin Laden and what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is calling for. They did not want other caliphates or Islamic states. They wanted decent states. They wanted states that deliver the goods. They wanted states that deliver bread, the social goods. This is by itself, it's a reminder for us. It's a reminder what matters. It reminds us where the middle public in the region is. Bread and butter, social public goods, dignity, having hope and jobs and what have you. It's very, very important for me because all the speculation you see, we do not know what's happening in Middle Eastern societies because we don't have access to information in the same way that my colleagues here can talk about Europe for a variety of reasons. We have limited, elements of information. The second point I want to make is that when we think about sectarianism, sectarianism is a constructed political phenomenon. This is a modern phenomenon, people. I'm not suggesting that the Sunni-Shia divide is not real. But it's not the same in Islam as it has been in Christianity. The Protestant-Catholic divide, there is a philosophical, doctrinal difference in Christianity. There was a rupture. There was a revolution. There is no such thing in Islam. It's about, the conflict in Islam cannot be seen through the lens of Christianity. In Christianity, we know what matters. We know the great conflicts. It was about philosophy. It was about doctrine. It was about a different worldview and ideology. In Islam, it was about personalities. It's about who should succeed the Prophet. And of course, it has been deepened and what have you, but the the Shia divide is neither philosophical nor doctrinal in the same way that it is in Christianity. It's a modern one. We have to understand the drivers behind this it's political, ideological. A great deal of investments have been invested in this conflict for political, ideological reasons. You cannot look at it in philosophical, theoretical terms, as we do. the conflict in Christianity. In Christianity, we know we differ a great deal. My grandmother, the way she views the Catholics is very different from how the Catholics views my grandmother as an Eastern Christian. There are real differences. In Islam, there is no such thing. A Muslim is a Muslim, period. The end of the story. Of course, the story itself has taken historical connotations in Islam, and yes, it has now become deeply entrenched. Sunnis and Shiites have grievances, and these political grievances are real, ideological grievances. The third point I want to make is that most of the conflicts in the region have political, ideological, and social causes, not sectarianism. In Syria, it was not about sectarianism. Millions of people revolted against the tyranny of Bashar al-Assad. The millions of people who revolted against Bashar al-Assad were not really about the Alawites. They were about what? The state has been controlled by the House of Assad since 1970. The same thing in Iraq. I mean, the conflict in Iran or in other countries. These are political, ideological conflict. It's about a massive developmental crisis. It's about the tyranny of the state. And yes, these conflicts, I mean, look, if I were Assad, of course I want to turn this conflict into a sectarian one. I want to say that this is all about sectarianism. Saudi Arabia and the Sunnis are trying to change the secular character of Syria. I mean, it served the interest of the regime themselves to turn these conflicts into sectarian as opposed to being a social revolution from the bottom up to change the bloody dictatorship and establish relatively representative, political system. Even the conflicts in Lebanon between Hezbollah on the one hand, this is a political conflict about power. You have vested interests, and the vested interests do not really want to concede or any kind of power. It's a conflict about power and interest, and yes, it has been now wrapped in sectarian terms. It has taken on sectarian terms. Why? We can talk about that. Why the political and social conflict, ideological conflict, have been basically transformed into sectarian conflict for a variety of reasons. There are no institutions. Civil society has been decimated by 50 years of authoritarianism. There are no civil society representative people. Many reasons explain, and I'll come back to that, why the conflicts in the region are turning into sectarian ones. You have no civil society. Think of what has happened to civil society from the mid-1950s to now. Been destroyed. No progressive, and destroyed by what? We know the history. Why? The authoritarian state, the post-authoritarian state, made sure that any progressive, any legitimate, organized, opposition was destroyed. It represented a threat. Think what happened to the socialists and the Marxists and the liberals under Gamal Abdel Nasser and then Abdel Sadat and what have you. They threatened because they wanted to come across as we are the only model that exists. But what they did by destroying civil society, by trying to devour civil society, you end up with what? You end up with tribes, you end up with sects, you end up with regions, you end up with a weak, fragile civil society. And when social conflicts basically, evolve, what you have now is chaos. You have communities can't talk to each other. There are no networks of communication. All I'm saying, please don't let the dust blind us. There is a great deal of sectarian dust. And we would be blinded by the dust if we don't focus on the social, ideological, economic drivers that lie at the very heart of the fundamental fault lines in the region. And I'll come back to that in a minute, if I have the time. Yet, I think I would be misleading you if I say that this kind of religious fault line is not real. I think we would ignore sectarianism at our own peril. And as historians and as sociologists, we need to take basically a stock of why the sectarianism is happening here. This is real. You can't, if I say we should not be blinded by the dust of sectarianism, at the same time, we should not be blinded by this creeping sectarianism that's almost destroying the states in the region. Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain, Pakistan, and what have you. Of quickly, I don't have the time, I just want to give you a kind of a glimpse, really a very broad, in broad strokes, why we have reached this particular point. Point one. I think the most important point to understand is that the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978-79 was really pivotal in basically sowing the seed, the beginning of this particular sectarian. Why? Again, I don't have the time. The Islamic Revolution in Iran in the late 1970s portrayed itself, depicted itself as well, as a universal revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to export the Islamic Revolution to the entire Islamic world. You know all what happened in Mecca. In Mecca, the mosque, the attack on the mosque. And many Muslims in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, even though they were very suspicious of the Shiite model of the Islamic Revolution in Iran provided a model, provided an idea, provided an example. If the Shiite Iranians can really destroy one of the most powerful, shahs in the world, surely we can do the same thing. We can do to our dictators what the Iranian Shias did to their Shah. And of course, the first shot was fired in Saudi Arabia in Mecca when a radical group took over, the mosque of Mecca, and really that particular moment really sent, shockwaves through the veins of Arab leaders in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt. They realized what happened in Iran could easily have a major impact on their government. Even though, and more importantly, because the Islamic Revolution tried to say, we're not Shia, we are Islamic. We are the real one. We are the most authentic. And this is, it terrified them. It terrified Sunni-dominated regimes that here we have Shiite Iran that could really damage our regime. How do we respond? How do we counter this Islamic model? Quickly, I want to move on because the second point is that the Iran-Iraq war, which is very much related to the Islamic Revolution. Not only the Saudis and the Egyptians, the Iraqis came to realize Saddam Hussein, here you have a secular, nationalist, authoritarian government, building its own hegemony, as Gramsci would say, its hegemony based on Arab nationalism, on secular nationalism, on Sunni secular Arab nationalism to a certain extent. And Saddam Hussein realized that really Iran could represent a threat to, because of a variety of reasons, of what was happening in Iraq itself, and also because of the presence of millions. The Shia community in Iraq represents about between 60 and 65%. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the war itself, but the war itself really reinforced this idea about the Sunni-Shia divide. Saddam Hussein depicted the war in Arabic versus Persian, in Sunni versus Shiites. Basically, Iraq being the gate, the eastern gate to the Arab world, stopping the Iranian herds, the Shiite herd, the Persian herds. Many Gulf states, Arab states, basically, helped Saddam Hussein. The conflict itself, the Iran-Iraq conflict, really, I know you don't remember it, was one of the most devastating conflicts in world history. You know now, you're too young to remember. In terms of casualties, even in terms of World War I, more people were killed in the war than in World War I in terms of the size of the population. You're talking about 1 million casualties, 2 million injured. Chemical weapons were used on large scales by Saddam Hussein, not only against the Kurds, but even against the Iranians. The first visit you go to Tehran now, they take you to the hospitals to show you the victims of the chemical weapons by Saddam Hussein. The third point, quickly, and I'm simplifying a great deal, is that the Shiite awakening or revival. And this is also related to the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Iranian Revolution really was seen by millions of Arab Shiites as a kind of a bridge, a ladder to climb the social ladder in their societies. I don't need to tell you how most Shiite populations, Arab populations, were treated as second-class citizens. Whether you're talking about Lebanon, whether you're talking about Iraq, whether you're talking about, literally speaking, and I'm probably it's an understatement, we're seen as really in Lebanon, I mean, not only in terms of the perception, but also in terms of power, distribution of power. Even though there were majorities in Iraq and Lebanon and other places, they're not really given their share in the political process. The Iranian Revolution provided this kind of really ladder for the Shiite community in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Bahrain. Here we have a model. And Iran poured billions of dollars and ideological capital to really reorganize these communities. Again, I don't need to tell you about what Ayatollah Khomeini did in Lebanon. I mean, the birthplace of Hezbollah and Amal. These communities became, politicized, became mobilized. And again, this played a major role that the Sunni regimes became very anxious. I don't know, again, if you remember, take you back to what King Abdullah II of Jordan said in this particular period, and is that it's the arc of the Shiite crisis, the famous statement by King Abdullah. You have the Shiites basically were coming, where President Hosni Mubarak quit saying openly, the Shiites are not loyal citizens. They cannot be trusted. They are alien. They are subversives. They're part of the Iranian. These are, you're talking about the president of Egypt, the most populous Arab states. You're talking about the king of Jordan, basically reinforcing dominant perception in the region. Not only Iran is a threat, thank you, not only Iran is a threat, but our Shiite population cannot be fully trusted, are not really potentially loyal citizens. Imagine. And here is the irony. Here is the irony. In the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1989, millions of Shiites fought like patriots. Tens of thousands of Iraqi Shiites were killed defending their country against Shiite Iran. And think of how Saddam Hussein treated his Shiite population. Instead of building on the idea of citizenship, on the Shiites being full citizens, Saddam Hussein, used, again, I don't need to tell you, again, to marginalize and also to segment society. I'm not saying Saddam Hussein was a fundamentalist Muslim, but the policies of the state itself spoke louder than words about how the Shiites are treated in Iraq itself. In many ways, you could say that the Iran-Iraq war could have served as a catalyst for the Iraqi state to build really a very, you might say, transparent, a very unified and organized society. Far from it. What I'm trying to say is that no, the Shiites are not subversives. The Shiites are not really somehow alien to Arab societies. They're full citizens. But the reason why we have seen the Shiite revival, because the Shiites on the whole have been marginalized, they have been excluded, they have been really integrated into, Arab and Muslim societies. And this, what I'm trying to say is that the Shiite revival scared, terrified, the dominant elite and the dominant political establishment in the region. And of course, this is not to say that Iran did not exploit and manipulate the Shiite community, big times. Because Iran, it was in its interest to spread its influence. Iran, for some of you know, Iran does not behave like a Shiite state. Iran behaves like an imperial state. This is not a state that is a Shiite. It's like, in terms of Iran is a state, is a state, is a state. Whether it was under Ayatollah Khomeini or whether it's under President Khatami, or whether it's under, the new leadership. I remember an anecdote. I never forget this particular anecdote. Anecdotes help. And historians, just to give my colleague an idea about the role of Islam in the politics of the Middle East. When he first came to power, Ayatollah Khomeini went to give a lecture at Tehran University about Islam and Iran and the role of Iran in Islam. So young student, first year, undergraduate, she stood up and said, Ayatollah, I want you to, it's on my mind, I have a question for you. And he said, what, dude? And she said, if I have to choose between Iran and between Islam, what do I have to choose? So Ayatollah Khomeini, being a brilliant, he said, what kind of silly question is this, daughter? You don't have to choose. There is no separation. Islam and Iran are one and the same. So of course, she's a very passionate student. She said, no, I really need an answer from you. It's on my mind. And he said, well, of course, you know what you have to choose. You have to choose Iran, because without Iran there would be no Islam. For Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran as a state, first and foremost. Even the man who was trying to spread the Islamic revolution. First and foremost, even the first phase, don't lose sight, people, of the ideological and political projects of the states. Because if you focus on the rhetoric, you lose sight of what's the deeper conditions that motivate, that inspire these states. Fourth, if you ask me what's the most important fact, and you have asked me this question more about really this rise of sectarianism. One, remember, for students, for you, it's not enough to give you a shopping list. You know that in social sciences. You have to have a typology of explanation. What are the dependent factors? What are the independent factors? A shopping list is not an explanation. You can't explain. I mean, I teach at one of the leading social sciences. It's all about social sciences. I've given you now a shopping list. That's not how you explain social science phenomena. If I tell you of everything that I've said, what's the most important driver or typology? I would say the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the destruction of Iraqi state institutions and the setting up of a new regime. It's not politics, you know that, we're beyond that. We're not talking about politics now. We're trying to make sense of why this is important, why the US-led invasion. Because the US-led invasion of Iraq not only destroyed the state system, it basically laid down a new system. A new system based in Arabic on al-muhasasa. Al-muhasasa in Arabic is the distribution of spoils among the various communities. In a nutshell, the American system basically got rid of the Sunni-dominated regime in Iraq and installed a relatively Shia-based elite in power. In many unintended consequences of the American invasion is that really the US invasion offered Iraq on a silver platter to Shia-dominated Iran. That's how it is. That's not the American did not, there is no conspiracy. The Americans don't think in such terms. The Americans wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They wanted to get rid of the army. They wanted to really get rid of the Baathists. They wanted to establish an order that they basically had thought could really somehow sow Jeffersonian seeds of democracy in the heart of Arabia. Forgive me, I'm an American, it's just naivete, it's stupidity and foolishness on the part of the neoconservative. They were just foolish. They didn't know. They thought somehow they could go to Iraq and sow Jeffersonian seeds of democracy. They were ideologues, divorced from realities of the region. I was in the thick of it. I and tens of thousands of people, the debate in America, go back to that particular period. But they really did believe that somehow you go to Iraq, you install a government, and it's going to be a domino theory of facts. Iran is going to fall Syria, and the US would, basically make the region in its own image. It's a liberal image. You got rid of the army, you got rid of the institution, but that's not how it's seen, right? We have to understand how the US invasion was seen in the region and in Iraq. It was seen as a kind of the America collusion between Iran and America, that the US installed the Shiite regime, that Iran was made the king at the top of the hill. That particular conflict, go back and see what happened. The Sunni resistance, the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, how Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi made the fight against the Shia existential. Even Al-Qaeda central. I wrote a book on that, The Rise and Fall of Al-Qaeda, by Oxford University Press in 2011. Even Ayman Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden backed Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Slow down. Don't target the Shia. Don't basically lose sight of the fight against the American. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was obsessed with the Shia. He wanted to plunge Iraq into all-out war, Sunni and Shia. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq could win the struggle. He almost did. By 2006, Iraq was almost on the cusp of really civil war. Of course, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was killed in 2006 by the Americans. And fortunately for Iraq, it was the Sunnis who revolted against Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. You remember the Awakening Councils and the Sons of Iraq, because what I'm trying to say is that throughout the region, the American invasion was not seen as an invasion against Saddam Hussein. It was seen as a kind of a project to get rid of the Sunni regime, even though Saddam Hussein was not really a hyper-Sunnist. I mean, he was a dictator, but he was not a religious fanatic. In fact, the man was more of a secular fundamentalist than a religious fundamentalist. But in the region, the American invasion was seen as this was, and this is why you have thousands of young men who traveled to Iraq to fight with Al-Qaeda and the Sunni resistance. The big point I'm trying to say here is that this particular conflict really poured a great deal of gasoline on this, beginning of sectarian conflict and spread. It's really spread near and far. And this brings me to a more important point than the conceptual point. Not only the US-led invasion basically helped to power, to drive, to fuel, to trigger sectarianism, but it basically cancelled Iraq as the major deterrence force to Iran. Historically speaking, in the Gulf, you had Iran and Iraq. The Western powers basically historically played Iran and Iraq against each other to balance each other. The Americans had a doctrine. Martin Indyk developed, Martin led the bullies kill each other, exhaust each other. The whole idea is Iraq and Iran, they would exhaust each other, and it's you know, in international relations, called balancing. You know, read the book by Walt. Balancing is you try to balance regional politics. So what happened, Iraq was gone. Saudi Arabia felt the need to stand up and try to counterbalance Iran. If you want to understand, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry did not start today. It really started in 2003, 2004. The cancellation of Iraq from the scene. Saudi Arabia felt, who's going to deter Iran? Who's going to stop Iran? Because remember, the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq canceled the two most important, you might say, Sunni states against Iran. The Taliban, a hyper-Sunni regime, and Saddam Hussein, a mainstream Sunni-based regime. Iran overnight became the unrivaled, Gulf superpower. And here, in this particular sense, Saudi Arabia had to really begin the process of mobilizing forces, of using all instruments at its power to counterbalance Iran. And Saudi Arabia, of course, it cannot balance Iran because Saudi Arabia does not have the means that Iran does for a variety of reasons. It does not have a big army. It cannot mobilize. Saudi Arabia is very wealthy, but it has a weaker, what we call in international relations, the sources of power do not allow Saudi Arabia to project power in the same way that Iran does. Iran is a giant state. It can mobilize 2-3 million men on a battlefield. This is one of the oldest nation states. Saudi Arabia has a lot of money, but it does not have the hard power, what we call, what states allow states to project power. So in this particular sense, it's not only Saudi Arabia, but if you go back and visit this particular period, 2004, 2005, 2006, even the Americans started talking about Condoleezza Rice, that famous statement. We're going to establish a coalition of moderate Sunni states against Shiite Iran, the Bush administration. Even the Americans started basically flirting with the idea that the only way to stop Iran, because the Americans, W. Bush and company, did not appreciate how their war in Iraq would really basically power Iranian power in the region. So they started thinking, and also in the sense, Sunni versus Shia. The only way, the first time that the idea of a Sunni state was really used by Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration as a counterweight to Shiite Iran. Again, I'm just giving you a glimpse of how the ideas, and this is where Hosni Mubarak and King Abdullah and the Saudis began to think in terms of really, how do we use all our assets? How do we use all our power instruments? And when I say, Sunni versus Shiite, the Shiites represent a minority, tiny minority in Islam. We estimate there's about 10% of Shiites, out of 100%, about 10%, out of 1 billion, and the numbers, nobody knows the number. We keep throwing numbers. Let's say 1 billion Muslims in the world. You're talking about probably 100 million Shiites out of. So it's a tiny minority. So surely if I were a Sunni state, it's a nuclear one. I mean, this is the most powerful weapon I have. And if it's all out war, I mean, this could... I'm just giving you, I'm not, but this is the kind of, is that, well, I mean, the idea of the Shiites are coming. The Shiites are converting the Sunnis. The herds, you know, we have to stop the Shiites infiltrating of the heart of the Arab world. These terms are, and sadly, very, very important. Another point, and this brings me, how much time do I have?
Well, 10 more minutes.
10, I won't take more than 10 minutes. This brings me to the Arab Spring. And I know you've heard all the nonsense about the Arab Spring producing the turmoil and the violence in the region. It's nonsense. The Arab Spring was not responsible for the turmoil that has ravaged the Arabic and Islamic world. This is a silly argument. It was the derailment of the Arab Spring. It was the sabotage of the Arab Spring. It was the counter-revolutionary forces and states that basically wanted to prevent any kind of real change. Again, I'm talking about Saudi and Iran. Think of Saudi and Iran for a minute. Both countries, which are rival, are counter-revolutionary powers. Both. So Saudi has invested about $150 billion in trying to maintain the status quo. Almost everywhere, trying to stop the tide. Iran, you would expect the Islamic Revolution of Iran to support what? Change. The revolutionary state, Iran, has fought tooth and nail to preserve a little dictator called Bashar al-Assad. A little dictator. Two states have played a major role in trying to sabotage, undermine, prevent any kind of state. Empirical facts. Think of how much resources these countries have invested in to try to preserve the system. Because Saudi Arabia wants to maintain the system, and Iran wants to maintain its allies as well. I mean, who would support Bashar al-Assad, regardless? Why would you support Bashar al-Assad? If you believe you are the leader of the al-mustad'afun or mustad'afin, and the disadvantaged, and what have you, the powerless, why would you support Bashar al-Assad? This tells you about power and politics. They're not supporting Bashar al-Assad because he's an Alawite. It's rubbish. Bashar al-Assad has just discovered he's an Alawite. He's a dictator, first and foremost, maintain interests, and he and the elites around him. Of course, I mean, comes from a particular background. Saudi Arabia is not supporting, trying to preserve the status quo. Saudi Arabia was very friendly with Bashar al-Assad until recently, 2011. Good terms. Hardly any major problems, you know. It's not politics, interests, and state powers. Saudi Arabia wants to make sure there are no threats to its interests. If I were Saudi, that's exactly what I would do. And Iran wants to have access to the heart of the Arab East, Syria and Hezbollah, the umbilical cord. I mean, without Assad, Hezbollah would be in a very terrible state. It would be the Hamas of Lebanon, basically besieged and what have you. So the Arab Spring, the derailment of the Arab, and the conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen have turned now into sectarian connotations. We think about them really in terms of civil wars, right? We stopped thinking about really what were the drivers, because the sectarianism now is basically engulfs everything else, and it's real. But we have to understand, again, in the next 5 minutes I just want to focus on if you ask me, I've been talking about the drivers. What you really have, if there's a term if there's a concept that really help us to understand what's happening in the region, is not religion. But the concept, I would come back to the radical Italian theorist, Gramsci, and say it's an organic crisis. What you have in the region is not a religious crisis. What you have in the Middle East is an organic crisis. What do I mean by an organic crisis? An organic crisis, it's a multifaceted crisis. It encompasses state and society. It's a crisis that has been accumulating for 50 years. Political vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities. Fundamental, massive fundamental developmental
failure, state failure. Think of the region. I mean, this is 300 million people. Supposedly, it should be the richest area in the world. The Middle East, by the way, is much richer in Europe in raw terms. It really is. In terms of population, too, you have resources that really have been powering the world economy in terms of raw resources. But what you have is massive developmental failure. That resources, the biggest cash flow in the world is not in China or Europe. The biggest cash flow is in our part of the world. But it flies away. It's invested somewhere else or basically squandered somewhere else. Truly, these are numbers, empirics. It's not the lack of money and resources, it's you have no institutions. The reason why Al-Qaeda and ISIS are dangerous, not because 30,000 fighters or 40,000 fighters. They are trying to fill not only a security vacuum, a vacuum of ideas, an institutional vacuum. There are no vacuum. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, tribalism, ethnicity, parochialism, militias, everything is what? Symptoms of the breakdown of state institutions. I mean, people say, oh, look at this bloody area. Why sectarianism? Why parochialism? Why tribalism? Why extremism? People, when institutions collapse, people fall back on what? People fall back on familiar terms. This is not just a Middle Eastern problem. Look at Europe. Look what happened in Europe till recently. When societies collapse, when institutions are dismantled by the regimes themselves. The West did not dismantle the institutions. It was Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad and Muammar Gaddafi and Ali Abdullah Saleh systematically destroyed the institutions that existed even under colonialism. What I'm trying to say is that in moments of duress, when societies break down, people automatically fall back on familiar terms. The sect, the religion, the tribe, the region. It's normal. You have nothing. Who's going to protect you? Who's going to take care of you? It's the local communities. So what we are seeing, we're focusing on the symptoms as opposed to, because there are no institutions. If you live in war-torn Syria or Iraq or Yemen, you're going to depend on your community, local communities, whether you like it or not. There is no other choice. There is total collapse. I mean, when I say I don't have the time to give you the numbers, out of the 320 million people in the region, we estimate on average 40% of Egyptians live either in poverty or below the poverty line. Unemployment among the semi-educated youth is between 20 and 40%, give and take. Blockage in the system, demographic crisis, no hope. I mean, the refugee crisis is not just a product of the civil war. The refugee crisis is a product of decades of developmental failure. I mean, it's not just in Syria. Go visit Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. Hundreds of thousands of young men loitering on the streets. No hope. I mean, the surveys that we have of the Middle East, 40% of young men and women in the region, if they're given the opportunity, they would leave today. Anyway. I would do too. Wouldn't you? We look at it in terms of, there is no, I mean, what do you do? People are, I mean, think of how many thousand people have died on the highest, and this will be with us, you're correct. It's going to be with us for many decades without rebuilding the state institutions. It's a very, finally, if my reading is correct, and it might not, remember, this is a kind of, and not based on my reading, this is the consensus in my colleagues. We're really talking about rebuilding the state. It's not about Islamic. Of course, you need reforms, and you need to reform Islam. Like you can't reform Islam, so you know that. Islam, it's not like I can press a button. That's not how religions and all cultures. In Europe, it took probably about 400 years. And in Europe, you had a papacy, you had a church. In Islam, you don't have a church. Who's going to do the reformation? What cleric or clerics, what countries? It's in Islam, the relationship between the believer and God is straight, direct. There is no, and this is a historical process, people. It cannot be done in 10 years or 20 years. societies have to reach a particular stage. Result of civil wars, the persecution. I mean, we know the historical legacy of Europe. So I'm not going to go to say, oh, let's reform Islam. First of all, we need to put back, we need to glue the system, the state system, rebuild state institutions. This is, because if you have institutions, that you begin the process of having a state. The states in the region, what we think in Weber, Weber told us about the state, the formal institutions are no longer there. You have family-based states. No longer you have formal institutions, you have family-based states. If I were crude enough, I would say mafia-based states. I'm not talking about the Gulf here, I'm talking about the Republic. So because the formal institutions have been dismantled. So you have to rebuild the institutions, you have to rebuild the state, you have to have a new social contract, you have to put an end to the spreading fires, the civil wars, you have to end the Iranian-Saudi rivalry. I mean, these sound like cliché. It's a very, very difficult, complex, long struggle. It's neither Washington nor Prague nor London can really tackle these questions. This is a historical process, take many years. Finally, a final point I want to make, and this is for all of us as students of social sciences and humanities. What's happening in the Middle East, and for you, I'm telling you, students, what's happening in the Middle East is not unique to the Middle East. You know that, huh? The Middle East is traveling a similar journey to what other regions in the world have traveled. Again, read Charles Tilly, one of the leading sociologists, American sociologists, German American sociologists, about state formation. State formation, people, is drenched in blood. State formation, if you look at the Westphalian system from 1648 to 1948, 300 years, drenched in blood, culminating in the greatest crime in world history, at the hearts of Europe, footsteps. You know what I'm talking about, the greatest crime in world history. State formation is drenched in blood, baptized by blood, by iron and blood. State formation doesn't come sit down in a room and we agree on a constitution. We fight the civil wars, the bloody civil wars, and then there's somebody, social class, captured the state. What I'm trying to say is that the Middle East is, sadly for all of us, because we're living in this particular moment. Your grandparents lived through terrible moments in the past. This is the moment. The question really for us about the Middle East is how long it's going to take, the state formation. Will it follow a similar, track to Europe? Will it take I don't know. Will the Sykes-Picot Agreement survive? The state system that was put in place by the colonial powers. How long will it take? These are open questions. In the meantime, sadly, what we are seeing is not state disintegration. What we are seeing is state formation in real time. And it's very difficult for us to really make sense of this state formation. Thank you. I've probably taken much more time than I should have. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fawaz. It was really impressive and in the same time pessimistic projection of what is going to be in the Middle East in the near future, probably. I think even we are a bit delayed. I think there is now a space for your questions or suggestions, or if you have some, please raise your hand, identify yourself. And if there is no question yet, I have the first one. You mentioned, Fawaz, that this is too complicated to have a shopping list to deal with such complicated issues in social sciences. But still, you know very well that politicians usually would like to have a shopping list from people like you. So would you suggest to politicians today of UK, of United States, what to do, how to deal with Middle East today? Okay, we can agree that the invasion of Iraq 2003 was quite complicated thing, but what can we do right now to settle the situation in sake of local population and also in sake of our own interests?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult, whenever, whatever policy, I often avoid giving policy recommendations because all policy recommendation, once you go that particular track,
you really fall into the trap of the costs of the policy. I really do. I usually don't. But I hope that what I have, the points I have tried to argue, I mean, implicit in the argument, what needs to be done. That this particular region has been neglected for many decades by Europe and the United States, and in fact, neglected, and the intervention, whatever intervention has taken place in the region was for bad reasons. I mean, it's the great powers view them at least important for the wrong reasons. It's for oil, for gas, for power, for interest. Really, the region has been neglected. The reason why Europe now is facing this, because Europe has really neglected its neighbors. We have not paid attention to that part of the world. In fact, we have sacrificed deep values in the Western world at the altar of selfish interests. I mean, the whole type, as you know, dialectics in international relations, the moral liberal question versus realist. I mean, Europe and the United States have really basically prioritized realism. In fact, obsessive realism, obscene realism, over any kind of human rights and what have you. Historically speaking, am I exaggerating to say so? No, not really. Point one. I think what we need to do is to really help, and I say to help Middle Eastern states and societies and to rebuild their institutions. That's really the most important thing. And what do I mean by that? In terms of development, in terms of productive bases, in terms of universities, in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure. Investment in what matters. Now you might say to me, we are poor, right?
Ask the people.
Yeah, you're right. But I just want to answer this question. You're right. Because money, there is a great deal of concentration of power. Most of the money, even in the United States and Europe, I mean, we know what's happening in Europe. And also, you have the West now really is inward looking. It's not interested. I mean, think of the only hopeful sign is Tunisia. Think of how little we have invested in the Tunisian model. But it's not a matter of money. If my argument is correct, there's tons of money in the area, right? You have hundreds of billions of dollars that need to be invested. What I'm talking about really leadership. Is leadership both in the United States and Europe that's been lacking. Because Europe, as you said, how do you tell the French president to worry about the productive, base in the Middle East where, unemployment in France is 15%? I mean, his future is on stake, his political future. What we're talking about is really leadership, global leadership, to really help, help to construct. Because no one is suggesting that the Western powers can do this and that. The West should not. This is a responsibility, first and foremost, for the people and societies in the region. We have to take it. This is first and foremost. But what the Western states can do can really help a great deal. Begin the process of helping Middle Eastern societies and people to put their house in order. Because after all, this is not, remember, it's 2018. I don't know if you remember 2016. I don't know if the year 1916 ring a bell to you. What happened in 1916? It's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? It's 100 years, a century. Literally, and this particular workshop now, it's 100-year anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the great powers decided how the broad contours of the Middle East. What I'm saying, if you ask me, it's about time to reimagine a different Middle East. Reimagine a different Middle East from either the colonial order or the post-colonial authoritarian order. And this would require all of us here, as to really sit down and try to help the millions of people who had a different, the reason why we keep coming back to the Arab Spring where you have millions of people, the greatest peaceful collective action in the history of the region, or probably 500 years. It's impressive what happened. So that's what I'm talking about. You need a kind of a really global leadership. You need a coherent strategic vision. You need to work with Middle Eastern societies to conceptualize a kind of a different kind of institutional framework for the societies. Try to end the regional conflict. I hardly said a word about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Where are the Palestinians in all of this? I mean, more than probably 100 years now. Well, 99 years. How do you deal with the Middle East without finding a solution to the Palestinians? This is the first, I mean, I know I should not, and you know Israel much more than I do. This is the last colonial experience in the world today. How can you talk about the Middle East without resolving this fundamental line, allowing Palestinian self-determination? You can. Can we talk about really beginning the process of state building without ending the Syrian civil war, putting Iraq back together, and on and on? These are complex questions. I grant you. It cannot be dealt with overnight. But at the end of the day, I mean, here you have, to give you an idea about the West. Barack Obama came to power, and he was determined to, the first thing to him, he said two things: the Palestine-Israel conflict and trying to resolve the conflict with Iran. Barack Obama knew exactly what needs to be done on the Palestinian-Israeli. We all know. The entire world knows, except Benjamin Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel. The entire world, the European Union, Barack Obama, and guess what Benjamin Netanyahu said? No, I'm going to keep building settlements. And what can you do about it? And guess what Barack Obama did? Oh, let's forget it for the next. This is the President of the United States of America. This is how, and whereas Europe knows, I mean, now it's impressive that European societies, European Parliament, are taking action into their own words. They're voting in the Parliament. This is what we're talking about. I mean, we can do it, honestly, I mean, don't underestimate our power. But the fact is we exert pressure on government to change their policies. Policies that are not just more immoral and cynical, but counterproductive. I could have imagined if the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was resolved in 2009. I'm not suggesting that would have meant the end, but at least we would have removed a fundamental fault line. One, I'm not going to say the most important fundamental, probably I should, but one fundamental line. And even the Western state, think of how, I mean, basically were reluctant to support the Arab Spring uprisings. I mean, whether Tunisia and Egypt, think of how torn they were. Because these people, I mean, served a particular interest. Again, a shopping list. But I think if there is one particular thing, I would say the Western powers, it's not about money. That region does not need money. That region needs global leadership, really, to articulate, to help articulate, conceptualize a strategic vision along with the people. And we don't see it. It's not there for a variety of reasons. The United States is leaving the region, as you know. Barack Obama said, I'm tired of this region. It's too costly. Nothing good come out of it. He has packed and been to the Pacific region, where America's future lies, literally speaking. In fact, he has been brought to Syria and Iraq kicking and screaming, as you know. Kicking and screaming, and it's a minimalist thing. He does not want to have anything to do with it. And the European Union, I mean, it has many problems on its hands. Now, all we talk about the refugee crisis. Yes, the refugee crisis and terrorism are important, but they are symptoms. They are symptoms of massive developmental crisis. If we really want to deal with the refugee crisis and terrorism, we need to address the drivers. And the driver is you need to help. Again, Europe cannot do it all, but to help. How? That's the big question.
Okay, there is a question by Mitchell Belfer, our IRIS department chief.
So first, I'm very sorry that I missed the bulk of your...
Well, you cannot ask a question if you miss the... because the bulk of my arguments are important to my arguments.
In the 5 minutes that you've spoken, there was a major contradiction that I should because when you talk about global leadership and then you talk about support for example, the building of institutions on one hand, but on the other hand, the way that you've talked about instrumentalizing of the West in the Middle East, I'd really like clarification on how those two ideas could be reconciled. Because either you want global leadership or you don't. I mean,
Thank you.
And to be honest with you, I also think that you have completely exaggerated the role of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which, by the way, you didn't raise obviously earlier. because the Arab-Israeli conflict has nothing to do with the sectarian violence that's unfolding in Iraq and in Syria today. So, although I may have come late, the points that you made are certainly those which can be,
Thank you so much, because I wish you had been here earlier, because you could have pointed to many more contradictions than the two you mentioned. You really could have. I mean it, but it's a shame. It's my loss, because all of us academics, as you know, are full of contradictions, and it's really true. Point one. Point two. I spent 40 minutes. I did not mention the Arab-Israeli conflict. Did I mention it once? Even once? Did anyone hear a word about Palestine or Israel? Did you? I really, it's a shame that I should have. I apologize. I should have spent more time. So there is no contradiction that, and I said, even if you remove the Palestine from the equation, you're still going to have man problem. Didn't I say that, Professor? So there's point three, your main question. Let's come back to the main question. The main question is, actually, your question is very important. I really mean it. I am not patronizing. It's very important because if you ask me myself, I mean, as a historian, I have really spent most of my limited life trying to think about the region in comparative terms. My teachers at Oxford and Harvard and the LSE and Princeton and Columbia have taught me really many lessons. And I've used their generosity. And one of the lessons, I wonder, I just want you for the students, I wish, and this is more wishful thinking, that the region could have been left to its own devices. I wish that the region could have been allowed to really go through its own pace. I wish that the Western powers and the great powers have not had as much influence on the region, for a variety of reasons. First of all, because many of us in the region would not blame the West for some of the mistakes and blunders that we have made. Secondly, the region would have probably evolved in a different direction, because I think we are obsessed with the other. The West, is that in terms of colonialism, in terms of domination, in terms of subjugation, in terms of post-colonialism, and how the West really exercises power, domination on the region. We really are. In this particular sense, the West has often, and I'm not exaggerating, and I've written really quite a bit on the West, even my dissertation at Oxford University, at the relationship between the Western powers and the Middle East. It really has often instrumentalized and manipulated and exploited the region for a variety of reasons. And that's what power is all about, international relations. International relations is all about, how states maximize their power. And I'm hoping, and this is probably wishful thinking, and that's why you pointed at my contradiction, I'm hoping in light of the spreading fires, I'm hoping in light of that the fires have reached now some of our shores here, whether Brussels or Paris or whatever. In light of that, I'm hoping that a new imagination, a new conceptualization, a new recognition of the need to begin to deal with the region in a different light. That's what I'm hoping. That's what I said, that is this possible? That can the Western powers reimagine, reconceptualize their relationship in the region for their own interest, not just in terms of morality. I think this is really essential for both, not only in terms of coexistence, but also in terms of interest, because the stakes for Europe are much higher than those for the United States of America, where I live. Because for a variety of reasons, historical, sociological, geography, and now interest. I mean, the relationship between European societies and the Middle East. That's what I meant. But at the end of the day, I fear that the power relations, what international relations theories tell us, it's going to take a miracle for the great powers to really somehow think of their relations with other regions in liberal, moral, non-power terms.
Please, if you can also identify yourself.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for a splendid lecture. My name is Kateřina Březinová. I'm from the Metropolitan University. First, thank you very much for bringing Gramsci to the picture and the organic crisis. For some historical reasons in this region, his analysis still stinks of Marxism too much for people. So this is not working, right?
Why not use this?
But my question is the following: we're talking, or you call for a time for new imagination of the Middle East. You call for you're describing this as not a failed state process, but rather a phase of a state building process. You're talking about a global readership. Since we're talking about local perspectives and how this process looks from the local communities, I just wonder whether you would like to address that. We spent some time talking about Barack Obama and global leadership, but we didn't really say how this state formation process actually looks like from the local perspective. So.
It's a very important, it really is a very important question. It's a very important question because also it points to another contradiction in my argument. It's one thing to say that what's happening in the region might produce a kind of a different state formation. A different state formation in terms of the social contract, in terms of having what we call really is that the rule of law. I mean, if you tell me about the genius of the West, it's not money. You know, the West is so rich not because of its money. The West is so rich because of its institutions, the rule of law. It's the separations of power, the social contract. This is really where it's not about money, because without institutions you can't. I fear what's happening at this particular moment is that there is a kind of fallback on sub-identities. The rise of parochial identities, the coming back of tribalism, sectarianism, parochial interest, regionalism, and what have you. And far from really thinking in terms of state, I mean, you have now tribalism. Some people say that the tribes are, I mean, the only guarantee for the survival of the states, whether you're talking in Iraq or Yemen or Libya. You're talking about now the rise of non-state actors, anti-hegemonic groups. It's not just ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, sectarian-based militias, you're talking about ethnic groups, you're talking about regional groups and what have you. So what we are seeing, in a way, we are seeing sub-identities are trying to really at least reimagine the Middle East, not in really kind of a state formation along Weber terms, but rather along really post-modernity terms. Point one. Point two, there is also, to give you an idea what's happening in the region, and this is why Al-Qaeda and ISIS are benefiting. They're benefiting because they're trying to fill this vacuum, the vacuum that the state itself, the state system is really fraying, that the ability of the state has declined a great deal. It cannot produce, it cannot provide bread and butter, it cannot provide employment, it cannot even provide security. I mean, think, what's the most important, I mean, fact that Weber told us about the state? A state that does not have a monopoly on the use of force is not a state. You have to have, is there a state now in the region? Very few states have a monopoly on use of force. The second aspect, taxation. I mean, extraction of resources. Most of the states don't have the ability to either extract resources, have a monopoly on the use of force, or even provide security. But more and more, the public debate, public intellectuals are really talking about Sykes-Picot. They're really saying that the Sykes-Picot agreement, that the state system needs to be re-envisioned in different ways. And this is, again, the first time really ever that people are and intellectuals revisiting this. And when we say, for some of you, most of you know what the Sykes-Picot is, really where the borders of the Middle East were set up by the great powers. And there is no concrete visions or ideas about really what the ideas, all they talk about that the system has failed. The state system is, and there are hardly any kind of choices or options put on the table. We are at the stage of people are questioning the state system and saying the state system has failed on multiple levels, but no concrete ideas. My take on it, and this is that even though the state system is having many vulnerabilities because of from within and from without, as a result of the points I mentioned, I think we should not underestimate the resilience of the Sykes-Picot state system.
the resilience, that think of how many people have panned the obituary of the Iraqi state or the Syrian state. And think of how hard, because the state system, even though it's vulnerable, it has really created, you might say, massive bureaucracies, security forces, networks of patronage, lines of influence. And these are, I mean, think of the Syrian state, think of how fragile. It's been fighting for 6 years. I mean, the entire world said that, I mean, the Syrian state, the Syrian regime would collapse. It's a matter of days, weeks, and months. Well, it has survived, even though it's fragmented. So to give you an idea is that there are no concrete ideas on the table. We're seeing two contradictory processes. We're seeing sub-identities are really emerging and rising. On the other hand, we're seeing the public intellectuals are talking about a different state system. How, the structure, the foundation, hardly any ideas about that.
Good day. Hello, Mr. Fawaz. Nice to meet you. My name is Yasser Daniel Reisk. I'm Egyptian journalist, and I know you for many years through the TV. Nice to meet you in Prague. I agree with many things you are talking about. I disagree with some things, and I have one question. You are talking about leadership, Middle East, which needs a new leadership. Can you imagine the so-called political Islam as a part of this leadership? For example, Muslim Brotherhoods or Salafists or such forces? Because I have the feeling that you have this kind of thought, which is well known in think tanks in Western countries, that these parties can be really a part of any democratic process in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. شكرا سيادة فصاعد. You're asking me, really, if you had asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have given you a different answer now. 5 years ago. Yeah. Here is the dialectics, the dialectics behind the question. The dialectics behind the question, if you're looking at, if you want to reimagine a new Middle East, if you want to reimagine if you have a new social contract, if you want to really see the Middle East respecting diversity of views, having institutions, taking various political Islam. I'm not talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm talking about mainstream political Islam. Probably is a very powerful social movement, almost everywhere. I'm talking about the variety of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Nahda. It is a powerful, influential, serious social and political movement. That's a fact. Can't deny it. And this has been there for a long time. For the last, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood was established in 1928. And to give you an idea, for some of you students who, in 1928, when Hassan al-Banna established the Muslim Brotherhood, he established a Muslim Brotherhood, his followers numbered fewer than 100 people. So 60, 70 brothers. By the end of World War II, we estimate the membership of the Muslim Brotherhood was between 500,000 and 1 million, according to, I mean, the classical Pax Mitchells on the Muslim Brotherhood. We do not know the exact, I mean, electoral power of the of the political Islamists. I would say, and I've written this after the Arab Spring, you're talking about at least 20%. At least. That is membership, they can vote, and they can co-opt, as they did in Egypt and Tunisia, they can co-opt between 20 and 45%. But their actual power is 20%. The question for us, how can you imagine, how can you think of the Middle East without basically taking this huge constituency into account? How can you basically dismiss this constituency? How can you basically try to exclude this constituency? If you're really genuine about reimagining it, point one. That is the predicament, the tragedy of the greater Middle East, now including Turkey. Turkey is emerging into a bigger tragedy, truly. Turkey, keep your eyes on Turkey and not just Egypt. The tragedy of the Middle East is that while the Islamists represent an influential,
powerful social and political movement, most of the political Islamists have not made the transition into what we might call a pluralistic vision, with the exception of Al-Nahda in Tunisia. Al-Nahda has really made a major leap forward. Al-Nahda by accepting the fact that the will of the people is the ultimate determinant of society. The will, the constitution, the constitutional mandate, the people determine what basically goes, not any kind of text, regardless of how sacred the text. It's the people. We in this room decide at the end of the day what kind of university is. We decide on the future of the university. If we are to be in charge of the Metropolitan University, not any kind of text or any outside power. Al-Nahda in Tunisia really has made it, and this is a major breakthrough in the Arab Islamists. Sadly for the Egyptian and the other Islamists, I think there is no clarity. There's a great deal of confusion. And in fact, when they came to power in Egypt, they really exposed the weakness, the intellectual and philosophical weakness of the movement itself. No critical ideas, no blueprints, no vision. The Muslim Brotherhood, in particular in Egypt, thought by capturing the state would be magical. The state itself would take care of itself. And I think one would hope is that the Arab Islamists, not just, Turkey is a different question because it's not, would really begin the process kind of really soul-searching, and a kind of really internal soul-searching and debate about the future. This is the only way for and I say it because there is no other way, because you cannot exclude them, because if you exclude them, you're going to have a segmented society, you're going to have an authoritarian society. That's regardless of whether you like them or not, they are here to stay. The question for the future of the region, that it's a big challenge on the Islamists themselves to begin the process to really conceptualize, articulate a vision whereby it's a vision that is pluralistic, an open vision, transparent vision, a vision that takes into account, not modernity, of course, but the post-modernity, is that the idea that societies have evolved, that society is now, regardless of what we have, even the text, we have to read the text in the spirit of today and tomorrow, as opposed to the spirit. So far, it's not taking place, with the exception of the Tunisian model, because the reason why it's not taking place in Egypt, because the Muslim brothers in Egypt feel that they are in the eye of the storm, that they are in prisons, that they are powerless, that they are excluded, that they are persecuted. So the sense of persecution is really basically lies at their inability or unwillingness to construct a new, you might say, imagination. But that's the only way to go. It's not about, you paint them as evil. It's silly. At the end of the day, for Arab and Muslim societies to have a healthy political and pluralistic political environment, all political units and parties have to basically conceptualize imaginations and ideas in the spirit of the contract, the rule of law and citizenship, as opposed to any kind of particular, vision based on the past.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerges. I think we can get back to many of the crucial questions which were mentioned during your presentation and afterwards, and I'm glad that the discussion started from the very beginning. Now we have to move on probably to another local perspective of Middle Eastern conflicts. You mentioned that some 40% of Middle Easterners would like to move elsewhere. Now, Karel Černý, who is from Faculty of Humanities of Charles University, he spent a few weeks with a small tiny minority of Yazidis in the north of Iraq. That means among the people who would probably also, some of them leave the region because of the threats posed by their neighbors today. However, they are still on the place. And Karel Černý made a field research among them about their perception of what is happening, about their wishes, how to solve their peaceful future. So, Karel, thank you very much that you are with us, and please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. So I would like to talk about my field research, which I have done in March 2016 in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish regional government, or it's called Iraqi Kurdistan. And basically what I did, I made about, let's say, or maybe more than 30 interviews with refugees or with IDPs who are with the Yazidi religious background. And I made these interviews both inside the camps and also, I mean, inside the refugees camps, but also outside the camps, because my estimate is that even now, I think less than 50% of the refugees from the Yazidi community are still living in a very bad conditions outside of the camp, and only, I would say, or I would estimate, less than 50% are now living or staying inside the camps. So I took my respondents from both of the groups, but I will try to generalize about them. What I was interested in, and what I will first of all talk about, is how do they see their situation, how do they interpret their situation, how do they interpret, like, what does it mean for them to be a refugee? And my question number one was, what are the motivations of them for the future? I mean, in terms of if they want to emigrate in Europe, or if they want to stay in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, or if they want to come back to their homes, which are mostly in the so-called disputed territories in Iraq. For example, the Sinjar area or the areas around the Mosul. I will later on show you the map. So I would like to stress here that I will not talk about facts. I will not talk about the reality. I will not talk about how things really are on the ground. I will talk about the subjective interpretations of the refugees, how they see their situation, in which ways do they evaluate their situation, and which variables they take into their equation while they are making their decisions about the immigration into Europe or into other parts of Iraq. So this is one more thing. So I will not talk about, for example, what I think or what are my interpretations, but first of all, I will try to present the perception of the refugees. Of course, as a result, there will be probably many contradictions which you will see in the discourse of the refugees. Yeah? So, but it's not my fault. It's really people normally in everyday life are using the discourses which are internally contradictory. It's normal. It's not only for the refugees. It's normal. Okay. So who are the Yazidis? Very shortly, they are one of the very interesting religious minority in Iraq. We can say that the religion is a kind of syncretic religion. So this religion combines many elements or many sources from very different Middle Eastern religions. But what is very interesting and also important is that the Yazidis, or their society, is based on the caste. So the caste system, yeah? So it's the same or very similar like in Hinduism in India, for example. Another very important part of Yazidi identity, which is very important for this context of being a refugee, is that they think about themselves that they are the eternal victim. They, part of their story and part of their identity is that there were already 72 genocides in the history of Yazidism. And this genocide, I mean the last one in 2014, done by ISIS, is only number 73. So they are thinking, okay, we are the eternal victims. We are always excluded from the society. We are always killed. We are always kidnapped. We are always raped, etc., etc. And this identity or this part of their identity, I think, has been strengthened after 2014. And probably the last point which I wanted to make is that there are about 560 Yazidis in Iraq, and about 300 or maybe even 400,000 of them are IDPs, are refugees. Yeah? So the majority of Yazidis in Iraq are basically refugees. It is said that they are one of the largest refugees community in Iraq today. I will just show you on the map where I did my research. The green is the Kurdish regional government. So this is the Iraqi Kurdistan. There are 3 provinces, Dohuk, Erbil, Suleimani. I make the research in this Dohuk province because most of the Yazidis refugees are concentrated in this province, in the camps and also out of the camp. Well, this is the map of the distribution of Yazidis before 2014, before the attack done by ISIS. And the most important thing here is that 90% of Yazidis were distributed in this area, which is called Sinjar. Yeah? It is Sinjar mountain, and it is in the Nineveh province. So it is part of Iraq. It is part of the central government. However, it is also part of something which is called disputed territories. Disputed territories, it means that there is ongoing conflict or ongoing discussion between the federal government in Baghdad and the Kurdish regional government, who really is controlling this territory. As I said, 90% of Yazidis were concentrated here in Sinjar area. Also, many Yazidis, or some Yazidis communities, were concentrated around the Mosul. And all these communities escaped to the Kurdish regional government. However, I will talk about it a little bit later. Their way to Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, was very complicated because some of them had to take the route via Syria, yeah, and they had to do very complicated circle and then to go back to Dohuk. Okay, so this is the context. Now I will already start to talk about my findings. First, I will talk about quite simple facts which people take into consideration while they are thinking, okay, we will probably leave to Europe, we will emigrate because we don't see any future, any hope here in Kurdistan. The cluster number 1, I mean the reasons that are very much connected to the situation in the camps. People are talking and I would say, yeah, are criticizing the very bad conditions, very bad material conditions in the camps. I think this is a really very good example, as Professor Gerges said, that this is really the symptom of the failure of the state institutions, because really, even after 2 years of the refugee crisis, there are still, for example, waiting lists to the camps. So really, there is higher demand. There are many people who want to be enlisted and go to the camps, but the capacity of the camps is still very limited. Yeah? So they have to wait. They have to really live in the tents out of the camps in a very, very bad and poor conditions. And it's already 2 years, and there are still these waiting lists. Yes. So this is example number 1, why people are thinking, okay, maybe we will really emigrate somewhere else because we don't see. We are waiting too long. We don't see any hope. Another problem in the camp, which people were really always talking about, there is a lack of water in the camps, drinking water, and especially a lack of showers and a lack of, let's say, toilets. Yeah? For example, for shower, we must wait for a few days. Every family has got a time schedule where they can take a shower. It's very complicated. Another problem, of course, lack of electricity. It's not only a problem of the refugee camps, it's the problem of the KRG in general. Even in the big cities, there is always lack of electricity. Another problem is healthcare. People and the refugees, they have, of course, many diseases, chronic diseases. For example, I have met many people with diabetes, and these people really don't have access to the healthcare that they need. So I have heard many stories like, okay, we have to go out of the camp, we have to go to the private clinic. My husband, who is a businessman, small businessman, he needed his car for making his business. He had to sell the car, yeah? He had to sell the car because I needed to buy the medicine. So there were many stories like this. Another problem for the refugees from Sinjar in the camps is that, okay, the camps are situated mostly in quite mountainy areas. So the climate is very, very hard for them. So the summers are very hot, and on the contrary, the winters are very, very, very cold, let's say. And most of the refugees, by the way, there are 12, I forgot to say, there are 12 camps primarily for Yazidis, 12 refugees camps. One of them is so-called, like they call it 5-star camp. 5-star, yeah? It's like 5-star hotel, because in this one camp, which is, by the way, run by the Barzani family, Barzani, president of the KRG. This camp, the only one camp, has got something like cabin or like containers. But the other camps are people live in the tents. Yeah? And another problem is that the durability of the tents is 1 year in these climate conditions. But the tents are now already second year under operation, and the tents are in a very bad shape already right now. It cannot sometimes protect them even from the rain, etc. So as a result of these bad material conditions, people are saying, okay, it's rational for us to make a decision and to leave, let's say, Kurdistan and try to emigrate to Europe, because these conditions under which we are living, it's a provisional measure. These are provisional conditions. We can make it for a few months, but not for years. Yeah, so it's too long for them. So first point here was that, okay, the basic needs, the basic material needs of the refugees are not satisfied, are not met, even after 2 years of the crisis. Factor, or let's say a group of factors or reasons, number 2, it's about bad social conditions in the camps. So the camps are overcrowded, so there are too many people in too limited space, living too long time together, which is creating additional stress. So you should imagine, okay, these people are traumatized by ISIS. Some of them relatives are still kidnapped, are in the hands of ISIS. So all these traumas from the war, from the conflict, this is creating, of course, stress, but there is also additional stress in terms of the camps, the conditions in the camps, which are really overcrowded. Another problem is there is lack of schools, and one of the main reasons why there is a lack of schools is because there is lack of teachers. There are 2 reasons. One reason is, okay, the intelligentsia is leaving first, so the doctors, also teachers, engineers, etc. All these people are leaving first to Europe, yeah? So there is not enough teacher. Second reason is that the Yazidi community itself is highly diverse in terms of language, because some of the refugees, for example, those from the Mosul area, but also those from Sinjar, some of them speak only Arabic, but some of them speak the 2 Kurdish dialects, the Sorani and the other dialects. But these dialects are also very different from each other, so they don't understand each other. So it's very difficult, for example, to find Arabic-speaking teachers. So as a result, for example, the schools in the camps that are operated by teachers speaking in Kurdish dialects, children can have education like even 6 days per week, yeah. But if you are a refugee who is Arabic speaking, your education is only very limited. It's for 3 days usually per week, yeah. So this is one more problem. So especially these Arabic speaking Yazidis are telling, okay, we want good education for our children, yeah, because the only future for our children is in education. So maybe we should try to get them to Europe, yeah, or at some other place. One more problem. People are always telling that one of the most difficult things for them is that they have got too much free time. Yeah, they don't have any meaningful activities during the day. It is a very big problem, for example, for older people from Sinjar especially, because these people are quite conservative and they were used to work very hard all their life. And now it's very stressful for them that they can only sit the whole day and they cannot work. So they are very often saying that, okay, we want some jobs, but we don't need the jobs only to make some money for us. Of course, we need the money, for example, for the healthcare. But probably even more important reason is we need some job because only when I am working, for example, on my field or when I am making business, I can relieve from the traumas. Yeah? I can a little bit forget about the problems and about the conflict which happened to me. So I want to have some meaningful activity. I want to have my job. I want to work because that can help me a little bit to go through these post-traumatic syndrome problems. Another problem, it is connected to the young people. I met few refugees who married inside the camp, but only few, very limited number. What happens very often is that it's almost completely impossible to make a marriage inside the camp because you need to have your own house if you are a young man, and you cannot have your own house. You even don't have a space for your own tent, yeah, because it's overcrowded. So it happens a lot, very often, that young people, the couples, the girl and the boys, are leaving or fleeing from the camps. They live together somewhere out of the camp for a few weeks or for a few months, and then they go back because they don't have any money, and it creates a lot of tensions between them and their families, yeah, because you must remember that this is very conservative society, and this sexual or possible of sexual interrelations among or between people without marriage, it is something like taboo. Yeah? So this is one more problem which the community is facing, and this is one of the most important discussion what people in the camps are talking about. What to do with the young people? How to deal with this marriage, let's say marriage crisis. One more thing, usually young people are saying that in the camps it's like in the military camp, like there is too much discipline for them and they don't feel comfortable there, and they are blaming the KRG, that the KRG is afraid that there will be riots in the camps, for example, or that some radicals will infiltrate the camps. So there is a lot of control, a lot of monitoring, a lot of discipline, and especially young people don't like this. And that's one more reason why they want to leave the camps. Okay, some people told me, but it was not, I was surprised, it was not that often, that also their religious needs are not met. Yeah? For example, they were saying, I want to go to the Lalish temple, which is the most important temple for the Yazidis. I want to go there, and I am used to go there every year, but I cannot make it because I don't have a car, there is no public transport from the camp, etc., etc. People are also saying, okay, we don't have our religious leaders in the camp, and we need them, yeah? Because the Yazidism is based on oral tradition. They don't have any book, yeah? So they learn about the religion and about the rituals from each other. So they need the contact with the religious leaders who are the religious experts, and they can also lead them in the rituals. Okay, one more thing which was very interesting for me. Also, it's connected to the camps. This is the problem of, I would say, tribalism in the camp and disintegration in the camp. problem number one is that most of the people were telling me, okay, we are missing our family members. We are also missing our neighbors from our village. And also we are missing the other tribe members. Because the families and the villages are spread all around the Kurdistan. So these families were cutted. The people from the same villages were cutted. They are isolated from each other. And for these people, especially the people from Sinjar, it's very important to be with their friends or from the same village, for example, or to be in touch with their family members. And family in this context, it doesn't mean the European type of family. Family, it means a lot of people like cousins and cousins of cousins, etc., etc. And they are really missing them. So it is problem number one, that people from the same villages or people from the same tribes or people from the same families are spread all around the Kurdistan, and some are already now in the Europe also. And these people are missing them, and they are telling, okay, we don't have contacts with them. Sometimes we even don't know where they are, yeah? And it's very stressful for us. On the other hand, the problem number two is that in the camp, the people are for the first time in their lives facing being in like very close physical contact with members from other tribes and with members from other villages. And this is sometimes creating tensions, like the tribes, for example, can have some old problems, old quarrels. And now these old problems and old quarrels are, let's say, refreshed. Yeah? These conflicts are again somehow important. And so I was very surprised that, for example, they were telling me there are sometimes tribal clashes inside the camp. Very often when I was especially talking with men, they were blaming the women. That they said, okay, the women are those who start some very minor quarrel. Yeah, for example, because they are waiting for the toilets or they are waiting for the shower, yeah, and they start to quarrel. Then they call their men, yeah. So the men are coming, and of course they start, also to fight, not only to quarrel. And the men then start to call for their family members and also the tribe members or the people from the same village. So then you can see that there is this escalation according to these villages' identities or tribal identities. Of course, many people are very critical, especially young, well-educated people are very critical about this. They were telling me, I never participate in this. I always tell them, if you are so brave and smart, why don't you face Daesh? Why don't you face ISIS in the Sinjar mountains? Why do you stay in the camp and why you are making these fights here? Okay, problem number 4, which is very sensitive, is that people in the camps, especially, are thinking that they don't have enough privacy, and the consequence of this, that they are thinking that the family honor, is threatened. Especially, they are saying, okay, we cannot protect the honor of our wives and girls. Yeah, we cannot protect the honor of them, but let's say, we need the woman to be clean, yeah? And if the woman, we can protect it, if the women are clean, if they behave in a good way, if don't have a contact with other people, with foreigners, with other tribesmen in the camp, okay, then our honor will be, let's say, saved. But we all the time, every day, are facing many situations where this honor is under threat, yeah? So we are stressful. There is a lot of stress because of this. One more thing which was very interesting for me, that in fact in the camps, however the people live there for, let's say, 2 years already together, there is a lot of anonymity. Like people are telling me, I know only my neighbors, I know only the other people from the other tent and on the other tent, but I don't socialize much with other people in the camp. One of the reasons is, of course, that there are these tribal identities. Everybody is trying to focus only on his or her family, yeah? First of all, family first. So it was very interesting that there is really a lack of solidarity, lack of unity among the refugees in the camp. And as a result, of course, people don't feel at home, like at home, of course, in the camps. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe. The last reasons why it's difficult to be in the camp and why they are thinking about immigration is that, okay, there is a lack of resources, there is a lack of aid. There is only a limited amount of aid. So the people are forced every day to compete. The families and the people are forced every day to compete over scarce resources. Yeah? So there is a lot of competition among families and among the members of different villages, for example, or tribes. And this is, of course, creating tensions and conflicts. One more thing is that there is a lot of bad feeling of injustice, because people are in the camps are every day evaluating or making comparisons, and they are saying, okay, I can see that some people are getting more aid, some people are getting less aid, and some people don't get any aid. Yeah? So there is this inequality in the distribution of humanitarian aid, and people see it, and then people are very frustrated about this. So it is one more problematic point. And of course, all the time people were saying that the distribution of aid is postponed. It's always late. It's always delayed. So as a result, as I said, it is strengthening the tribal and other tensions inside the camps, but it is also creating a lot of riots and a lot of demonstrations of refugees who are sometimes going out of the camp, and they are, for example, putting the cars on fire, or they are putting even houses on fire, or they try to block traffic or the roads, because they try to push, especially the Kurdish regional government, to distribute the aid in a much better way. And one more thing is that all this refugee crisis is going on under severe economic crisis of the KRG, and it is very complex economic crisis, and the problem is that the crisis started almost at the same time as the refugee crisis started. So the KRG is in a very bad shape. I will just name few problems. Of course, there are these falling gas prices and falling of the natural gas prices, which is the main income for the KRG. I think like 80 or 90% of income of KRG went from this oil, selling the oil, and now the prices are very low, so there is the economic crisis. Another problem is it is connected with the conflict with the central government, the conflict between the Kurdistan and Baghdad. And as a result of this conflict is that the Baghdad stopped, let's say, paying the money for public workers. So a lot of people are claiming, are telling that they didn't get their salaries for more than 6-7 months. Yeah, so it is one more problem. Of course, the KRG is in the military conflict with ISIS, and so most of the public or KRG expenditures, most of the money now cannot go now for refugees to help them, but now most of the money must go to the military, to the Peshmerga, to fight with the ISIS. Another problem is that most of the foreign transnational corporations, especially the oil companies, withdrawal from the Kurdistan. So it is one more problem. One more problem is that there is this big influx of refugees. So we can say that in Kurdistan there is like 5 or 6 million people, local people, but there is 2 more million refugees. Yeah, there are refugees from Syria, for example, and of course there are these IDPs from Iraq. So you can imagine like 6 million inhabitants and 2 million refugees. Yeah, it's something. I think in Europe we cannot imagine this. Of course, there is also, and it was very interesting for me. Everybody was telling me that the international NGOs, the humanitarian, for example, humanitarian NGOs or the United Nations, they are also withdrawing. So they are not giving as much aid as they did like 2 years ago. So this is one more problem connected to this economic crisis. There is a lack of trust to the central government. the most often accusation to the federal government, to the Baghdad, is that in 2014, every family, every Yazidi family or every refugees, IDP's family was promised to be granted 1 million of Iraqi dinars. However, they are saying that some people, some families get this aid even twice or 3 times. Some people get only some portion, some small portion of this grant, but the refugees are telling, okay, the most of us didn't get anything. Yeah? It's already 2 years and we didn't get this. So that is one very frequent accusation of the central government. Of course, the central government is accused because the Iraqi military didn't do anything. It's simply collapsed. Of course, people are also claiming it's not only a problem of this military protection, but they are saying, okay, the Baghdad government doesn't do any investigation of the war crimes that happened, yeah, and we don't see that the central government is trying to establish justice. Okay. There are also talks about, let's say, the role or the status of minorities in Iraq. Some people are saying, okay, the Baghdad constitution or the federal constitution is very well written in terms of minorities, but it's very badly implemented, so the minorities don't have secured their rights. But some people are even saying, okay, the constitution is in fact very bad. It's not secular, it's not civil constitution, but it's Islamic. A kind of Islamic constitution. That's what they are saying. Yeah? Okay. There is also problem with lack of trust, not only toward the federal government, but also lack of trust toward the Kurdish region government. The accusation number 1, which is the most important, is that the Peshmerga forces promised the Yazidis that they will protect them before ISIS. Yeah. And even people were telling me, we tried to leave our houses, but before the ISIS attacked us, but the Peshmerga forces on the checkpoints sent us back to our houses. Yeah? Even the Peshmerga forces didn't let people to escape, especially at the beginning, like in the summer of 2014. Another very strong accusation, and it's very sensitive, is that, okay, Peshmerga in fact didn't fight with ISIS. Peshmerga, in fact, leave their position between 1 and 6 o'clock in the morning. It was very coordinated and very well planned in advance. So they simply leave the positions in all the Sinjar, and they left the villagers in Sinjar to be unprotected against the ISIS. People simply don't trust to the Peshmerga because they are saying, okay, it's not a national army. It's first of all a party militia, which is protecting the interest of the party, of Barzani, for example, Kurdish Democratic Party. So it's not protecting the interest of the people. It's not protecting the interest of the nation, but it's like kind of mafia organization. They are protecting the party interests. So it's another problem. So the Yazidis, for example, are saying, okay, we can imagine to go back to Sinjar and not to leave to Europe, only if Europeans will give us weapons and will help us to create our own militias, which will be protecting our villages. Also, they are asking for UN peacekeeping operation. They say only if there will be some UN or American military present in Sinjar, for example, we can come back. This is a very sensitive issue. This is the lack of trust to Arab neighbors. Because this 2014 genocide created a lot of distrust and tensions between the Yazidi community and their Arab neighbors. First, they are blaming the Arab neighbors or Arab villagers that they joined ISIS, or they are saying, okay, maybe they didn't join them, but they just used the opportunity and took our property, took our land, took our sheep, took our women, etc., etc. Also, there are these accusations that, in fact, Arab neighbors betrayed the Yazidis, that, in fact, they knew that the ISIS is already coming, but they didn't warn them. Yeah? Or there are also many stories like Yazidis were telling me, okay, some of the Arab neighbors called me in the morning that the ISIS is coming, but because I didn't trust them, I thought this is just a threat, that they just want to make us leave and then they want to take our, let's say, property. Yeah. So there are many claims like this. There are different interpretations of this. I will skip it, but some people are claiming, okay, the Arab neighbors are influenced by the tribalism, and it's normal in tribal societies that if you can use the opportunity, you can take the property of other people. And these Yazidis are saying, okay, this tribalism, these tribal wars are not targeted only against the Yazidis and other minorities, but the Arab tribes are doing this toward themselves also, so it's nothing specific. But another interpretation is that, okay, this is very much connected to the Islamic radicalization, that Arab neighbors were very nice 10 years ago, or before 2003, but then they became very, very strongly influenced by the Islamic radicalism. Okay, so I have to finish here very shortly. I will also say that there is a lack of trust more generally toward Muslims. I was very shocked or surprised that Yazidis are using the very similar discourse of, Islamophobic discourse, which we have got here in Europe. Like, for example, they were asking me, why do you let the refugees, the Muslim refugees, go to Europe? It's very dangerous for you. Like, they are saying, okay, Islam is very dangerous religion, or Muslims are potentially terrorists, etc., etc. So this is one, and the last thing which I will conclude here, it's very sad. I think it's probably the most sensitive finding for me, because the Yazidis, refugees, were telling me that they simply feel to be abandoned, not only by the Baghdad or by the KRG or by Arab neighbors, but also by their own elite. So they think that, especially the party elite, the Yazidis who are active in Kurdish Democratic Party especially, but also the elite, like tribal elite, the chiefs of the tribes, they feel that they really abandoned them, that they were the first one who escaped because they had the informations that the ISIS is coming and that the Peshmerga withdraw from the front line. So they saved their lives. And also these people are seeing every day that the distribution of aid is very strongly connected to these connections. If you have somebody in the party, or if you have somebody who is close to the tribe leader, and if so, you have a lot of aid, you have a lot of humanitarian aid. But if you don't have these connections, you are simply lost, completely lost. So I would conclude here that one of the hypotheses could be that in this context of the failed states, people will turn for protection to the tribes, to the tribalism. But we can see that it doesn't work much in this case, because simply there is this disintegration of the tribes, because the general Yazidi population is feeling that the tribe leaders, for example, don't do anything for them. So thank you very much for attention. Sorry for my English.
Thank you very much, Karel, for a really interesting insight. This information we can hardly find in our newspaper here. I guess there will be some questions also from you. So please, if you have any, just ask. Small question.
Karel, zdravím vás. Jsem rád, že jste zpátky. I'm happy that you are back in Czech Republic. I have one question. It's also so sensitive. Did you listen something about women who became pregnant because of the violence of ISIS? How they are solving this problem, which is so sensitive in that society? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, this is one of the biggest issues which is discussed among the Yazidi community. There have been more than 5,000 of children and girls and women who were kidnapped by the ISIS. About 1/2 of them have been already freed or liberated. But it happens many times that these girls or women came back to their communities and they are pregnant. And it is really a very sensitive issue because it is a highly conservative society. I was surprised by by the way how the Yazidi community is dealing with these girls. Especially the religious leadership is playing, I think, very crucial role in integrating these girls back to their communities. Especially the religious leadership is telling the people all the time that we cannot blame them because they are victims, yeah? And they didn't want to be raped. It was very difficult for them. The religious leadership is taking these girls usually first into the Lalish temple. They are taking the girls to the, it's called Zimzim or like Zamzam in Mecca. This is also like spring, like water. And they can wash there symbolically, like clean them. And they officially, I mean the religious leadership is officially taking back these girls. Also, the religious leadership is trying to work with the families because people were afraid that the families will not accept these girls. They will not accept them back because they were raped, and they probably already, some of them have got already children, yeah, with the ISIS fighters. So this is very sad point. But I think it is a very good example of how, in fact, this refugee crisis is changing maybe the social norms or the gender relations more in general. One more thing which was very interesting for me, especially for the Sinjari people who are, as I said, very conservative. They told me 2 years ago we couldn't even imagine our women to fight in IPG, for example, in the Kurdish militia. We couldn't imagine that women could take weapons and fight because we thought, okay, it's only like men's job. But now they are saying it's very good, it's very prestigious, we support this. And there are, of course, cases of these Yazidi women now fighting in the Peshmerga or in PPK, IPG. So thank you for the question.
Břetislav Ostranský, the Oriental Institute. First of all, I would like to thank you for excellent contribution. And in your speech, you mentioned many times lack of trust or fears or suspicious. But if I ask from the opposite side, in whom Yazidis trust, or in another words, from a Yazidi perspective, who is regarded as a natural supporter or partner? Could you specify this?
Thank you for the question. I think it is the main finding, maybe, of my research. That it's very sad, but I must say that, in fact, especially the people in the camps, they don't know who to trust. Because as I tried to make this list, like Baghdad, KRG, Arab neighbors, general Muslim population, both Kurdish and Arab, and also the leaders of Yazidis, both the tribe leaders and the political leaders, they promised them a lot of things and then they abandoned them. Yeah? So I think it's really very sad, but I don't see anybody who they think they could trust, because their trust has been like betrayed many times. But I think maybe one, but I am afraid they will be again frustrated, because they will telling me, we trust the West, we trust the United States, we trust Europe, that we trust that, for example, there will be some United Nations peacekeeping operation, that American military will send some troops into the Sinjar to protect us, or at least that Europe will really very strongly take part in this conflict, and that they will at least give us weapons, I mean to Yazidis, and give us training, give us equipment, so that we can have our own troops, not the Peshmerga of KRG, but our own troops in our own villages. And that's the only way how we think we can protect ourselves in the future. So in fact, one of the general findings of my research was that in fact now there is a lot of frustration, they are even disoriented because they don't know now who they could ask for help, who they could trust. I'm sorry, it's very sad, but it's my findings.
So thank you very much. No more questions? So thanks once again, Karel. I think all of us appreciate your really good field work in Iraqi Kurdistan. I think we will get back to some of your issues once again later in the day. As you know, we are a bit delayed. However, the coffee break is also a very important part of such events. So we will cut it just a bit. So let's agree that we will meet here at 11:45. Is it okay with you? So thank you very much. And the coffee and some cakes are upstairs.